Hello and welcome back. Sean here, Mountains Garage in the sunny and humid state of Maine. Mid-80s and humid today. Kind of sticky, but because it's late in the summer, the nights are still pretty cool. So the shop stays around 70 degrees in the heat of the day. So even without my fan running, it's quite comfortable in here until you step outside. Today I'm working on a 9-inch Ford. You saw me briefly highlight these aluminum center sections. They're Dana Spicer. I found them on eBay. They're relatively inexpensive. And they're 3.25 carrier bearing. Now this video is all about identifying a 9-inch Ford and determining what you want, because while it sounds simple, I'm just going to put a 9-inch in something, the possibilities when it comes to the center section and axles and ring and pinion, there's a lot of choices, and you have to decide what's right for you and what's available. So let's start with the carrier itself. When I buy one, I shop for the 3.25 bearing. Stock Ford cases, which you don't want to use for anything high performance because they're weak, except for the factory twin rib nodular if you can find one. Good luck with that. But the rest of the Ford cases are inherently weak, and they come with a 2.89 carrier bearing or 3.06. Now, you can throw out a lot of numbers, and I'm going to try to keep this understandable, but basically Ford had small and medium, and the aftermarket covered the large bearing for the carrier. You can buy bearings for the 3.25 case like this one to put parts associated with everything into this. Going the other direction, trying to put, well, now we're going to talk about spline. 28, 31, that was factory Ford stuff. You had one or the other. The aftermarket, you don't see a lot of 33 spline for a 9-inch Ford, but it does exist. But more popular is 35 or 40 spline. By the time you go to 40 spline, you have to have, with some exception, a 3.25 carrier bearing case, because the bearing obviously is larger on the outside. It's also larger on the inside, the ID. So for everything I just mentioned, that was axle spline, 28, 31, 33, 35, and 40 spline are what's out there in the world in the aftermarket. My choice with the 325 case is I can use any of that. Today, I'm setting up, it's a 410 Richmond ring and pinion. And here we go, talking more numbers. With a 9-inch Ford, you have small and big pinion, 28 spline and 35 spline. If you buy the Daytona style pinion support, you can just buy the correct bearings to fit in here to put in either pinion, the 28 spline, which is far more common, or the 35 spline. Most of your 28 spline ring and pinions are street. The metal they're made out of is made harder, if you will. Believe it or not, the race or the pro ring and pinion is slightly softer to take impact, and most of those are the 35 spline big pinion. There is crossovers, but for the most part, that's what you're going to get. If you have a small pinion, it's probably a street gear. Now, NASCAR uses street gears. I mean, it's not that they're, just going to blow up because they're harder, but in all-out drag racing, you want the slightly softer compound. So 35 spline typically gets you that, because that is normally race only. You definitely got throw out a lot of numbers to talk about a 9-inch Ford. So now let's talk what I'm trying to accomplish today, and most of the numbers that I've mentioned are going to keep coming up, so bear with me. Today I want to install this 28 spline Richmond 410 ring and pinion. I have the matching 28 spline yoke, because if this was 35 spline, obviously the yoke is bigger and the seal is different. The ID of the seal is larger. So I have all that. I have a set of ring gear bolts. A long time ago, well, a couple years now, I bought 14 NASCAR G-Force was the brand. Detroit style lockers. They're 325 Baron, and everything in NASCAR is 31 Spline. I have to credit NASCAR with the 9-inch Ford popularity. I mean, drag racing has used it pretty much exclusively as well, but NASCAR ain't grabbed it, I don't know, first or at the same time. Back in the 60s, and I think they pretty much went across the board. That's the rear end of choice. And right up until the new car they started running this year in the Cup Series, the trucks and Infiniti still use a 9-inch Ford, so these parts are still available in bulk. More so now, the Cup's not using them, I guess, but it's all super quality stuff. It's all 3 1/4 case. It's all 31 Spline. So if that's your, need, then that stuff will work just fine, or you can pick and choose. It's nice quality stuff. So I have the spacer required to set up the pinion bearings. You do not want to run a crush collar on anything high performance, because a crush collar will continue to crush with big power from your driveline and lots of traction. You set up your preload with a crush collar and you think it's going to stay there, and it will in a stock vehicle for the most part, but you start having the tires hook and keep impacting the drive shaft, you're just going to continue to crush the collar. It's going to get really tight, and then it's going to get really loose and fail. That is one of the big failure points in a differential. We'll get to the other one in a minute. So you use your shims, and the beauty of a 9-inch Ford is the races go in, there's no shims behind them, there's no shim under the inner bearing. You set your preload, like I said, with the shim kit. You just keep popping the inner bearing out and changing the shims till your drag is correct, and then you shim the pinion depth right here with a big shim. So you set this whole thing up on the bench as a unit, and you just shim the whole unit for pinion depth. Couldn't be any simpler. Let's cover the other failure point. We'll go off the reservation again for a second. In a 9-inch Ford, you have spanners on either side to adjust your carrier bearing preload. So you set your backlash where you want it, and then you can add preload just by turning the spanners. Couldn't be any easier. If you have, the dropout style peg, like all your GM stuff and a lot of your Chryslers, you can't get enough preload on a new set of bearings. You think you do. You think you're going to drive it in there without spreading the case. You'll get it in there, but once those new bearings break in, now your bearings are loose, and so is your carrier, and it's going to fail. You got to spread the case. That's what a case spreader is for. That's how the factory did it. That's how the factory got those big shims in there. A lot of times when you take the bearing caps off that style rear end and the pig falls right out, it's loose. If you got to pry it out, how are you going to pry it back in when all you have is shims? If you had the correct sized solid shims like the factory used, you might get them back in there, and you think you did it, but it's going to fail. In any high performance application, you got to spread the case. If you're running that style rear end, and a lot of people don't because they run the 9-inch Ford. Easy to set up, lots of parts availability. You just can't beat them. So then I got thinking, what do I want to use for carrier? Because I'm just building this one to keep. I got another one to build. I got a purpose for it, but this one here I was trying to consolidate some of my parts. So I'm thinking I have out in the shed a 9-inch Ford narrowed housing with 35 spline axles. I said, I have a 35 spline spool. It's a Yukon, but it's special. On the box it says, and the price they charge is pretty incredible, all they did is take a 35 or 40 spline spool, which should take the larger ID bearings, that's the difference, and they machined it down to take the same bearing as a 2.89 or 3.06 case. This takes the same bearing ID as this 31 spline spool that I have. So I need a 3.25 OD bearing, and this thing is loose on the carrier. But the beauty of it is I don't have any in stock. They make a bearing to go from a 2.89 and a 3.06 size differential or spool to the 3.25 case. So you're not out of luck with a 9-inch Ford. You just got to buy the right bearing. I had a situation in the rear end that I installed in the 64 Dodge Dart. I did that setup. I think I did it on one of my early videos, would have been a few years ago when I built the rear end that I eventually put in the Dart. I had a 3.06 aftermarket case, twin rib cast iron case that I wanted to use. But I wanted to put the 3.25 NASCAR Detroit style locker in there. And I saw a set of conversion bearings online. So I was on the phone with Quick Performance, where I get most of my parts. And they're super knowledgeable, super smart, but the guy I got that day was joking around because I buy enough stuff there. He, feels comfortable joking around, I guess. And he told me I was crazy. Those bearings didn't exist. I said, well, if I call you back with the part number, will you check it out, He says, I'll give you a t-shirt if you call me back with the part number. Well, I should be wearing the t-shirt today because I went back to the eBay listing that I had saved. I could blow it up enough. I could read the number. Couldn't find these locally. It's a pretty specialized bearing. Called him back, and he had a set in stock. So I got those and the t-shirt. I put those bearings, which I have to admit, they're pretty small in the bearing department because of the real estate. It's a big hole in the middle and a small hole on the outside. The bearing is probably fine, but smaller than normal. But it's rare to go that direction, but you can. Those bearings are available as well if you happen to, like me, have a surplus of 3.25 lockers kicking around. But I don't buy the 289 or 306 cases because everything's a hassle. So unless you have a need or have a bunch of parts you need to use, start out with the 3.25 and you can just adapt up or down and do whatever you got to do. And in the end, you'll be a lot happier. And if you want to upgrade later on, I could build this today with a small Pinion 410. I might want to put a big Pinion, God knows what I want to put in there. So, with a spool, I could buy all the good stuff. And it's upgradable, whereas the 2.89 case or the 3.06 case, you're stuck. You're not going to be able to do that. Spools and axle splines, I got to cover that for a minute. The 28, 31, 33, 35, and 40 splines. Across the board, doesn't matter who manufactured the spool or the axles, they're all cut the same. With the exception of, and this is my next problem, Mark Williams. Mark Williams has their own style spline, and they make a universal spool and universal axles, and they make their specific ones, which are stronger. Like in my orange race car, that had all Mark Williams stuff. It claimed back in the day, that was an old Pro Stock car, it had a 35 spline axle and spool package, and they claimed back then that was stronger than the 40 spline stuff that was available. But I have another one of these I got to put together with a 40 spline spool, and the axles in the rear end housing that I'm supposed to match up to are Mark Williams, the different ones. And that particular spool by itself is $400. So instead of being a $100 spool, it's a $400 spool. So that stinks, but there's no way around that. You can't make that fit. So there's no adapter when it comes to the splines inside the differential. I like to go back while I'm shooting these videos and review the footage every few minutes and see how many mistakes I've made. And in this case, I made a mistake when I was talking about setting up the pinion bearing preload. You keep removing the outer bearing, the small one, off the nut end and changing your little shim pack in between. The inner one you just press on and forget about it. So I said inner when I meant outer. So that's that. Probably later on I'll watch the video. I'll get it all posted on YouTube, and I finally sit there and watch it, and I said, nah, there's another mistake, Shawnee. When it comes to setting up pinion depth on the 9-inch Ford, all ring and pinions are not created equal because whoever manufactured it most likely ran it in on some kind of machine that is indexed off the master housing dimension, pretty much the imaginary center line of the axle to the back of the pinion. You have to know where to measure. And on their machine, they set it up for whatever harmonics, so they have a sweet spot, and then they indicate the sweet spot, the depth on the head of the pinion. And also, if you're lucky, the backlash. This one is marked. The penmanship wasn't very well, but I can make it out. There's a dimension for me to measure the depth, and there's a backlash setting written on the ring gear, 8 thousandths, so, which is pretty common. If you didn't have that, then you can, of course, start with a shim, and on a 9-inch Ford, if you start with a 20 thousandth shim, it's probably going to fall between 20 and 30 thousandths, and you have to keep checking the pattern. If you've installed it to the correct housing dimension given to you, you can go ahead and check it. You know, if you set it up to their information, it should come out right. If it isn't, you better check a few other things. And one thing that can trip you up is not all cases are split exactly on the housing center line. So I take a depth mic with all this removed, and I'll measure, you know, from the center this way, from the center this way, to make sure that was actually cut in the middle, because some are and some aren't. So if it wasn't, if it was favoring one way or the other, and you're using, that's how you measure your depth down to the head of the pinion from this parting line, well, that could potentially make your numbers wrong. Well, I know it will, because I've made that mistake. So something else to watch for. So hopefully your ring and pinion has some hieroglyphics written on it, giving you a clue where to set it. Or you're on your own and you're going to probably set it up a few times, getting it right, just going by the pattern. When I ran my orange car with the nitrous on, I had 1,450-ish horsepower according to the power speed calculator. I had a clutch and a Lenco. I mean, pretty brutal atmosphere for a 9-inch Ford. And I always bought used ring and pinions. That was my budget. What I liked about buying good used stuff, you know, 30, 40, 50 runs, typically it's marked on it, the ones I bought online or at swap meets or whatever. Now, this is all big pinion stuff, pro gears. It would, you know, typically indicate the amount of runs, and also it would either come with or tell you what shim it had in it when it was installed last. So I got one out in the shed, it's a 457 Strange Pro Gear. It says use 30,000 shim, so that actually makes it easier. So, you know, for me, for a low buck guy, I mean, if the ring and pinion isn't damaged, you just saved yourself a ton of money, and it's, you know, I never had a problem. I never broke, well, I broke one. It's the one that came with the car though, and it had been excessively clearanced. So that's that, I guess, on that subject. But, you know, I'm not against putting together used stuff, but it's nice to know where it was installed before. Because if I put this in incorrectly, it's brand new and it breaks in, well, it kind of has to stay there. It's probably too late to go back to where it should be. Who knows? I guess that's the danger of used parts. But if you shop, you can buy some pretty inexpensive new stuff. So briefly back to axle spline count for a minute. I get asked this question, I have been asked this question a few times, what should I get if I'm starting from scratch? Well, if I'm buying a spool or a carrier and a set of axles, go as big as possible. You know, go 40 spline, at least 35. You know, if you're going to do some high performance stuff, you're going to have a lot of traction available. But, you know, start from the other direction, 28 spline, that'd be fine in a lightweight street rod that you just, you know, always going to have a hard tire on. You're not going to stress it too much. 28 spline would be fine. 31, I mean, like I say, NASCAR uses it. I think it's acceptable for, you know, LS powered stuff, especially on a small tire. It's minimal, but if you want to stay in the realm of really available parts, like using NASCAR stuff, I mean, buy a nice set of aftermarket 31 spline and know that it's on the light end of, you know, duty cycle. Say 33 is kind of strange, but you do see them. 35 is a good number, but if you're going to go 35, 35 is the end of the line for having like a Detroit locker. There are other style differentials available in 35 spline, and if you know of a 40 spline differential, I've never seen one. It'd be pretty rare and pretty gummy, probably weak. If you're at the 40 spline threshold, just buy a giant spool and a set of giant axles and let it rip. That thing will probably last forever. At that point, they even gun drill the axles because the axles are pretty beefy and heavy. So that all the pro stock stuff, I mean, they've stressed and tested and stressed and tested, and they know what they can get away with. And that stuff's all gun drilled for weight. So, and the flange where the brake rotor would go is all milled out. I mean, they know where to take the weight away and still have it strong enough to do the job. So, but if you just buy them from scratch, if you want to build a heavy duty rear end, buy the 3 1/4 case. There are bigger ones available, but might as well stick with something that's fairly universal. You can buy bigger housings that take a 9.5, 10.5 inch ring gear, but for today's talk, we're just talking, a 9-inch Ford will get you a long ways. You can go into the 6s and a 1/4 mile with a regular 9-inch Ford. You can do it more reliably with something bigger. So I guess that's it today. Thanks for following along. And I hope this wasn't too confusing, and I hope at least somebody's still awake watching the end of the video. Catch you later.